Welcome to the VO2 Lounge podcast. In this episode, we'll be discussing jet lag and designing an air travel protocol for yourself. We will discuss what jet lag is, adapting to new time zones, some flight prep tips regarding sleep and hydration, some key supplements taken from studies and the Peter Attia Drive podcast, should you be wearing a face mask, and much more. So my reasoning behind this episode is I myself have literally come back from a not very long flight, only 4 hours, going from the UK to Marrakesh. But whenever I do a flight, I'm always thinking, what supplements should I be taking? Because one, I somewhat struggle with flights. One, it's the temperatures, it's the light, it's the amount of space. I'm 189 centimeters or 6'3" and a bit. So I'm not really designed for being on a plane. It's not really the width, although being a moderately wide human being, I'm about 85 kilos, not exactly overweight. So it's not that, it's just the leg room, it's the confined space, it's the dry air, it's the altitude, it's the move. It's just not the most pleasant place to be. You got other people there. So I have, since my previous flights to South Africa, which is then a much longer trip, wanted to really read a bit of literature, look at some forums, look at some articles, and put together how I would go about creating a travel protocol. One, for maximizing comfort. Two, for ensuring that, one, I don't really get sick, and two, I don't feel horrendous on the other end, and three, especially for those night flights or for flights going between transcontinental flights and anywhere that jet lag is going to be a real issue. How do you best mitigate that, and how do you get to sleep, one, in an environment that's not the most comfortable to sleep in, and two, in circumstances when you're going to sleep outside of your normal sleeping window. In particular, say you're going to bed at 6 p.m. rather than say 10 p.m. How do you facilitate that sleep? Again, in an incredibly uncomfortable environment. Now, as always, there's going to be an element of this that is specific to athletic performance and specific to athletes themselves. For me personally, I've never done a long flight to go and exercise somewhere. Maximum flight I've done is about 2.5 hours to go, and I saw more of a cycling holiday rather than a training camp or a race. But there is the potential of doing some races abroad and what's best to do with that. But it's more for these people, for example, Cape Epic at the moment, what would you do if you're going to compete there? Because that's well within the realms of an amateur and also obviously a professional. But there are often events that people want to do in Europe from the US. There's people who want to do stuff in Southern Africa and Northern Africa from the UK and the US and all around the world. And there are often instances where you're going to experience some either jet lag from a physical time shift or from the process of flying itself, which is quite draining. Now, very conveniently, there is a 2012 study titled Circadian Disruption and Remedial Interventions, Effects and Interventions for Jet Lag for Athletic Peak Performance that can help us cover most of our basis on jet lag. So let's start off with what is jet lag. Just as a little side note, studies like this very study and many others that I find through PubMed take me to this site called Springer Link, which offers you to buy a copy of this sports medicine sample or paper or publication for about $25. If this happens to you, it's just worth noting that if the paper is a little old, if the paper is like 6 months old, then it's probably a case that it is still behind a paywall. But if it's like, in this case, over 10 years old, then you can often find it published through a free source such as ResearchGate, while this main publication of it still remains behind a paywall. So if you find it, just have a quick Google of the title, just copy and paste it into Google, and then either put ResearchGate at the end or don't even bother, and you'll either find a bunch of people talking about the paper and therefore the paper is not free, or you end up finding it through another third-party site like ResearchGate, for example, where you can find the papers published by the original authors and so on and so forth. Now, jet lag occurs as a result of rapid transmeridian travel where individuals cross multiple time zones, either from east to west or west to east. The severity of the jet lag increases with the number of time zones crossed, with even traveling over 3 time zones typically resulting in an individual experiencing jet lag. However, no jet lag is experienced when traveling north to south or south to north, regardless of the flight length. This is because the transmeridian travel disrupts the body clock, causing it to fall out of synchronicity with external conditions, leading to jet lag symptoms as the clock attempts to adapt. What I will note is this is for jet lag itself as a concept, as in quite literally jet lag. This doesn't mean that you can't feel incredibly fatigued, get sick, or just suffer from such poor sleep on the flight that you feel these similar effects. It's just that when you get there, a day or two of proper sleep can then realign you back in, whereas traveling over multiple time zones, those, if not done correctly, those first 2 nights aren't going to help realign your clock / rejuvenate you. Now, normally the body's internal physiological rhythms are synchronized by the body clock to external light dark conditions. Humans are diurnal creatures, primarily active during the day and sleep at night. Obviously, we all know that. And their circadian rhythms regulating physiology accordingly. For instance, waking typically occurs around sunrise, and sleep onset is preceded by dim or no light, stimulating the production of melatonin. However, transmeridian travel disrupts this regulation, causing normal activities like sleep, walking, eating, or to occur in a normal external light dark conditions. Essentially, you may feel awake when it's nighttime, or you may feel sleepy when it's during the day, and so on and so forth, and fall outside of your optimal performance windows. Now, circadian rhythms, internally generated rhythms persisting in the absence of external cues like light or darkness, allow organisms to time their behavior without relying on external conditions, and this enables them to anticipate external conditions rather than merely react to them. Now, disruptions occur following rapid transmeridian travel when external conditions conflict with the internal pacemaker. Now, while the body clock is capable of adjusting to new conditions, it has evolved to adapt very slowly, or just slowly in general, to changes in day length over several days and weeks. Thinkers like the clocks change, / think of just as seasons go on, whereas an abrupt change can occur over the course of 24 hours by traveling around the world effectively by aeroplane. The fastest rate of adaptation is about half a day per hour of time difference when traveling westwards, and 1 day per hour when traveling eastwards. However, the rate of adaptation westwards is facilitated by the fact that the average human free running period is about 24.2 hours. This is the length of time it takes for an organism's endogenous rhythm to repeat, effectively return to the same phase, in the absence of environmental time cues, making it easier for individuals to adjust to a longer day. Nonetheless, substantial individual variations in adaptations exist. So some people will be affected more, some people will be affected less by traveling across various continents and time zones. As I've already mentioned, jet lag, flight-induced fatigue can also occur from poor sleep quality in general, hindered by also the fact that even though the cabin is pressurized, it's only pressurized to equivalent altitude of between 1,500 and 2,200 meters. Things like Dreamliners can improve this and improve the atmosphere. As we know, sleeping at altitude is problematic and can result in poor sleep. The same can happen through travel on a plane. Let's look at the effects of jet lag. So athletes often require to travel long distances for events like particularly the Olympic Games or other international competitions, are particularly sensitive to jet lag disruptions. Despite attempts to minimize its effects, such as adjusting travel schedules to allow for adaptation to local time before competition, complete mitigation is often very challenging. I've mentioned it in a different episode talking about particularly Beijing Olympics, talking about how they moved the time at which the swimming was going to happen. I think it was the 100-meter final. Sorry, 200 meter freestyle, 100 meter freestyle. I think 100 meter freestyle. Don't quote me on this, but they moved one of the events. It was a big uproar because of the fact that they had specifically been training at that time of day to improve performance, because you're looking for such small gains. Now, think of this if you're then preparing to race at that time in another country and so on and so forth. It means the amount of time you need to effectively acclimatize. The bottom line is, we'll skip to a little point, is that really, if you can do, you go as soon as possible. 2 weeks even beforehand, especially if you're going quite far away. But obviously for amateurs, especially in things where maybe they're going to go do... I'm just using Cape Epic because it's currently going on at the time of recording. But if you're going to something like that and you haven't got the ability to go so far ahead of schedule, and you're coming from somewhere like America where you have got a pretty hefty time change, then this is where these strategies are going to really become important for those individuals where maybe you can only get there 2 days beforehand and don't have a lot of time to acclimatize, and you are going to be suffering the effects of jet lag. But jet lag symptoms vary between individuals, but commonly include poor sleep, daytime tiredness, loss of appetite, and decreased performance. Travel disrupts sleep patterns, making it difficult to initiate and maintain sleep due to the body's internal clock being out of sync with external conditions. Eastwards travel results in difficulty falling asleep at bedtime, while westward travel causes problems with early waking. I can testify to this. I remember going to Barbados, maybe not quite 10 years ago, but I remember at that point I was 16, and 9 o'clock to 8 o'clock, 8 to 9 o'clock really on a weekend was a staple wake up time. 6 o'clock was the most antisocial thing in my eyes, and 5 o'clock was definitely not the time I was going to be waking up. And we went there, 7-hour time difference, I believe, something in that realm, maybe a bit less. And I was getting up at 5 a.m. every day. So that's westward travel for me, and that's what they're showing here. Now, jet lag also affects athletic performance, as many aspects of exercise performance show circadian rhythms throughout the day. Peak performance typically occurs in the late afternoon, coinciding with optimal neuromuscular function, maximal oxygen uptake, and grip strength. Other methods such as peak force of muscles, maximal anaerobic power output, and performance in various sports-related tasks also exhibit daily rhythms. Jet lag disrupts these physiological measures, and as the internal timings for peak performance become out of synchronization with external conditions following travel, this effect may last for several days, impacting an athlete's performance significantly. This is why you can also get it, especially in cycling, where the calendars are so hectic, and the Olympics is not always... First of all, it's not the priority of the team, because you're going there as a country, not as a team. So you may not get much time when you go to the Olympics. In this case, it's in France this year, so for most athletes, it's not a problem. You're racing in Europe anyway. Whereas when it was in Japan, that's a big time shift, and you've got things like athletes leaving the Tour de France early, like Mathieu van der Poel, because they need to go acclimatise, and they're targeting earlier events that aren't the road race. Now, for example, an elite male runner may experience a notable slowdown in race times following air travel across multiple time zones. Same for cyclists, same for powerlifters, same for everything by the looks of things. While some studies show no effect of jet lag on performance, others demonstrate a prolonged depression in performance and physiological functions. Recovery from jet lag may take several days, even for relatively short flights. In addition to physical performance, jet lag negatively affects cognitive performance and can have longer-term consequences such as cognitive defects, mood disorders, increased cancer risk, and cardiovascular disease. Now, despite the severity of the symptoms, many athletes may not recognize the effect of jet lag, attributing symptoms to stress or other factors. And educating athletes about the symptoms of jet lag is kind of a critical part of all of this, and that is hopefully what you're doing if you're listening to this episode. So obviously we know jet lag's bad, but how do we best adapt to jet lag and how do we overcome it essentially? Adapting to the local time zone before traveling is a nuanced process that depends on the several factors, including the duration of the trip and individual variability in circadian rhythms. Short trips, typically lasting 1 to 2 days, present a challenge for full adaptation because of the time frame is too brief for conventional methods to take effect. Moreover, there are currently no instantaneously acting remedies for jet lag. In such cases, attempting to adapt may even worsen the situation, as the athlete may only partially adjust and experience jet lag upon return to their native country. Therefore, it's generally recommended for athletes to maintain their home time zone during short trips and schedule important events at times when they are most alert and perform best based on their home timing. On the other hand, for longer stays, typically exceeding 4 to 5 days, there are strategies that can be employed to facilitate adaptation either upon arrival at the destination or even before the trip begins. These strategies involve leveraging various environmental cues such as light exposure, meal timing, sleep schedules, and exercise routines to synchronize the body's internal clock with the new time zone. By reinforcing these cues or exposing oneself to stronger than normal cues at specific times, it's possible to promote alignment with the destination circadian rhythm. Now, this is something I feel like people almost overlook, and I never really think about it, but obviously the fact that you go one way, and if you spend 2 weeks somewhere, you may finally acclimatize to it, and then you come back, and you've got the same issue when you come back home. Now, light exposure plays a crucial role in resetting the circadian rhythm, with timing, intensity, and wavelength all influences its effectiveness. Now, you will see this a lot on the Huberman Lab. He talks about light exposure a lot when it comes to, I suppose, sleep quality in general, overall health, mental. There's a long list, but what effectively they're trying to achieve on that podcast and by talking about the importance of light, although it's relating to not travel, the fact that it's such a strong stimulus is then a reason to keep it in mind for when you are traveling and almost living to that life of exercise and light exposure at the different points in the day and help the body adapt to the new time zone. Now, melatonin supplements have gained attention as it means to promote adaptation, but their timing must be carefully controlled to avoid adverse effects and maximizing efficacy. Melatonin secretion is influenced by light exposure and plays a key role in regulating sleep-wake cycle. By strategically timing melatonin supplementation, it is possible to manipulate the circadian clock to align with the new time zone. But exercise has been shown to affect circadian rhythm as well. Although the effect mechanisms are still being studied, early morning exercise tends to be associated with phase delays, while evening exercise may lead to phase advances. However, conflicting evidence exists regarding the effects of exercise on melatonin secretion and circadian phase shifts, highlighting the need for further research in this area. This is a commonality. If you've listened to other episodes I've done, essentially every paper you read, they should say further work needs to be done, because even in a meta-analysis where they're scanning a bunch of papers, really the way papers are done and the way the results come out in the end is like, most of the time something's wrong, either sample size or repeatability or something's going on that means you're like, this isn't definitive enough. There are still other factors at play. There are still other things going on, and we really should do more research to understand further what is going on here. And that's essentially no different for jet lag and overcoming jet lag. Now, dietary interventions have shown some promise in animal studies, but their effectiveness in humans for jet lag adaptation remains uncertain. While certain eating patterns may influence circadian rhythms, the practical implications for jet lag management are still being explored. Now, overall, pre-adaptation to the new time zone may be desirable for critical events, but it requires careful planning and consideration for individual variability in circadian rhythms. Tailoring adaptation strategies to each athlete's specific need of circadian circumstances is essential for optimizing performance and minimizing the effects of jet lag. And essentially, you could just move an hour a day. Maybe you go to bed at 10, you bring it back to maybe 7 to account for some of that issue that you're going to encounter in the jet lag. Or in the other instance, it's a bit hard. That's easier to cope with, because then you can wake up early before work, get stuff done before work, go to work, come home, go to bed early. The other case where you're having to delay sleep, for most people, is probably going to be a bit jarring. If you're someone who already goes to bed at, say, 10 p.m, then you've got some wiggle room. In reality, if you're then getting up 6, you could move your wake-up time maybe to 7 or 8 if it is possible. Say you work at 9. But for someone who's already going to bed at like 11 or 12, there's not really much movement unless you're someone who either works from home and can get up and get straight to work, or you have the ability to move your day, maybe you're self-employed, so on and so forth. That's the only way you're going to really get around it. So unfortunately, if you're someone who already wakes up late, it's a bit tricky. The next points are more going to be now focused on the protocol. What we've already covered is possibly a bit of how to adapt and a bit of what the actual effects of jet lag are, but we don't really need to know that much. It's the simple that we've all experienced it, or probably all experienced it, and if you haven't, you're probably about to if you're listening to this episode. First on the list is something people don't always consider, and is how dry plane cabins actually are. This is often somewhere between 10 and 20% in comparison to your home, which is probably 40 to 60%. And so it's very easy as a result that staying hydrated is quite a challenge, as moisture is easily transmitted from your skin and through normal breathing into the atmosphere. When you inhale, it dries out your esophagus area. When you exhale, this moisture can be carried out really easily. And just generally, it's a dry environment, which isn't great. So tackling this problem by looking at an article titled Exercise and Fluid Replacement, although we are not going to be exercising at a rate or experiencing a rate of dehydration comparable to exercise, we can use the pointers to guide us in achieving maximum hydration before the flight and during the flight, and then post-flight. In theory, the idea is we're not going to get dehydrated, so we don't need to focus on the rehydration portion on the other end. Now, especially when considering it can sometimes be hard to get hold of adequate amounts of water on a flight. Before we start through this, it's fair to say that it's best to get hold of a large bottle of water you can in the airport, or taking a large empty bottle through with you. Be careful though on connecting flights. If you haven't done a long haul before and you're not going direct, connecting flights, that sometimes they will scan your fluids again in the second airport. So if you've bought a massive bottle, they may tell you drink it or throw it away. So maybe at the first stop, either you've got your big bottle dry and you buy a smaller one for that first leg and then fill up the other bottle, so on and so forth. But it's just something to note. It's also worth mentioning that it's a good idea to avoid any diuretics like caffeine or alcohol on that day. One, because if you're trying to sleep on the plane, just keep caffeine in your system as low as possible. And caffeine and alcohol, both diuretics, are going to result in you losing more water. And when you're already struggling to stay hydrated on the flight, this isn't going to help the situation. Now, proper hydration before physical activity is essential for optimal performance and well-being. Now, in this case, the goal of pre-hydration is to begin the activity in a state of euhydration with normal plasma electrolyte levels. If enough fluids have been consumed with meals and there's been a recovery period of 8 to 12 hours since the last exercise session or a last bout of dehydration, the individual is likely close to being euhydrated. However, if significant fluid deficits exist or there hasn't been enough time to rehydrate adequately, a more aggressive pre-hydration strategy may be needed. Now, pre-hydration protocols involve slowly consuming beverages aiming for around 5 to 7 ml per kilo of body weight at least 4 hours before exercise. If urine output is low or concentrated, additional fluid intake around 3 to 5 ml per kilo should be consumed about 2 hours before the activity. It is also beneficial to consume beverages with sodium around 460 milligrams, so 1300 milligrams per litre. Differs on the individual, but you can just stay on the lower end really, and include small amounts of salted snacks or sodium containing foods with meals to stimulate thirst and aid in fluid retention. So that's effectively achieving the point of hydration. Now, once on the plane, really you can drink to thirst. If you're someone who you know has a habit of getting dehydrated, then you can drink slightly more. But my point here would just be try maximize the most you're getting out of your water. So it can be through adding a bit of sugar to it, just some kind of carbohydrate, or consuming like a carbohydrate with it, because that is going to maximize fluid absorption. And together with that, you'll probably have some sodium. You can just take little electrolyte tabs, or you could take little powder sachets. It doesn't have to be expensive, just helps with keeping that water absorption going. Don't worry about going to the toilet frequently. Yes, it can annoy people. If you're doing an overnight flight, then the pre-hydration is a bit more important, because you ideally want to get to the point of falling asleep as hydrated as possible. And then when you wake up, you're just effectively coming back to this pre-hydration/rehydration protocol, where essentially you'll be consuming the beverage slightly more aggressively at the beginning with carbohydrate and sodium to ensure that you rehydrate quickly. The next one I'll talk about is face masks. Now, ever since I got extremely sick on a flight to South Africa, I have used them pretty much all the time, even for short hauls. One, for the whole barrier effect of them for illness, essentially. But also, I find it's quite nice, especially if you're sleeping and you end up sleeping with your mouth open. That little pocket of moist air now, I think, helps personally with the whole dehydration issue and having a sore throat and feeling just uncomfortable in general. You can use a buff to have the same kind of effect, but why not look at the effects of masks? So when it comes to face masks, COVID-19 made it a real topic of discussion for people to argue about the effectiveness and how people struggle to breathe with them on. But for the purpose of this pod, let's just use papers generated from the pandemic to understand how we can provide ourselves with a physical barrier from any airborne pathogens and that may be on the flight. Now, it doesn't mean people are actually sick on the flight. It can just, especially if you're going to a new country, the chances of someone carrying something that you're not already exposed to are moderately high. So looking at a study titled Efficacy of FFP3 Respirators for Prevention of SARS-CoV-2 Infection in Healthcare Workers. They open with the following. Now, consistent with the World Health Organization advice, World Health Organization 2021, the UK Infection Protection Control Guidance recommends that healthcare workers caring for patients with coronavirus disease should use fluid-resistant surgical masks type IIR as respiratory protective equipment unless aerosol-generating procedures are being undertaken or are likely when filtering face piece. FFP3 receptors should be used instead. Following a recent update, an FFP3 receptor is now also recommended if an unacceptable risk of transmission remains following a rigorous application of hierarchy of control. Now, skip through a bunch of this, but they state that a recent systematic review undertaken for PHE concluded that patients with COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infection who are breathing, talking or coughing generate both respiratory droplets and aerosols, but FRSM and where required eye protection are considered to provide adequate staff protection, according to the Public Health England 2020. Nevertheless, FFP3 respirators are more effective in preventing aerosol transmission than eventually cloth face masks or the surgical kind of face mask. and observational data suggests that they may improve protection for healthcare workers. It has therefore been suggested that the receptors should be considered as a means of affording the best available protection, and some organizations have decided to provide FFP3 or equivalent respirators to healthcare workers caring for COVID-19 patients, despite a lack of mandate from local or national guidelines. Now, essentially, they conclude that FFP3 respirators may therefore provide more effective protection than cloth face mask, the surgical face mask, for healthcare workers caring for patients with COVID-19, whether or not aerosol generating procedures. It's just essentially a medical procedure that might result in patient either coughing or you're agitating what's going on in that throat area, and it generates an aerosol as a result. Maybe you're blowing something into their mouth or into the lung cavity, for example, and result in the aerosolization or aerosol of the pathogen and droplets and so on and so forth are undertaken. Now, there could be plenty of people coughing and definitely breathing with some sort of pathogen that might be novel to you, especially when you're traveling to a new country. So for me, if it doesn't drastically hinder your ability to sleep, ignore what if people give you some kind of funny look. But unless it is drastically affecting it, I personally, in particular, going on a long haul flight, will use one to the best of my ability to help prevent the transmission of any of these kind of aerosols or droplets and so on and so forth. Also using the general idea of using a hand sanitizer, because really the toilet area is a pretty grim place, and even if you wash your hands, you can't guarantee everyone else does, unless you're opening the door, washing your hands while you've got the door propped open. You often end up having to touch some kind of dirty surface. There's lots of dirty surfaces in the airport. There's lots of people from lots of different places. So for me, I make the habit of washing them hourly through the process. Obviously, if you're asleep, don't do it. But especially when I come to eat something, or especially when I come from the toilet, I always use some hand sanitizer to help keep things at a minimum, the amount of bacteria, the amount of microbes, all that kind of stuff going on and around. Now, looking at some supplements specifically, everyone's favorite topic, to do with air travel and to do with overcoming jet lag. Peter Attia has, I think, both on the Drive podcast and also on like a Facebook little blog post / video post, some information that he provides on supplements. And I think it provides a reasonable datum on things, given as, first of all, as a medical professional, and second of all, has a reasonable amount of experience traveling through different time zones and overcoming jet lag, as he stated. Now, the list also coincides with a few other sources on the internet, and it's worth noting that any of the prescription pharmacology he mentions, I will not be listing, given the nature of obtaining such pharmacology, and I don't even think half of them in the UK I would actually be able to obtain, for the reason of I want to help overcome jet lag. I think that's something either you'd need to know a professional, or you'd have to have a very willing doctor, or they may not even be available in the UK. So I don't know enough about them, and they're not readily available probably to most people listening to this episode. So I'm going to stick to the supplements, and I'm also going to, there's a couple in here I think that he doesn't, but have shown good research in other places. So the list essentially is 3. I'm going to keep them all in milligrams. Some people jump between grams and milligrams because of the size of these dosages, but just to make it easy for the listener, everything's going to be in milligrams. So 3 milligrams of melatonin. Note this is only for a day or two, so for on the flight and then in your new time zone to help fall asleep. If you're going to be using this consecutive days, the dosage has to come right down, so maybe even not more than half it, so not even 1 milligram. We're talking 0.5 of a milligram, for example. 400 milligrams of phosphatidylcholine, which again you can look this up. It's PHOSPHATIDYL, and you can find it in various different forms, tablets, gummies, I think, But yes, again, for a few days only, and you'll be taking this specifically for the flight and maybe for the day before you are trying to, the day after when you arrive in your new time zone, if you're struggling to fall asleep, for example. Then 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams of glycine. I would add staying away from caffeine the day of the flight, and then the day after, use it if needed to stay awake. But if you're struggling to sleep or predict based on the time shift you're doing, you're going to struggle to stay asleep, probably stay away from it that day as well. I personally am quite a high responder, quite sensitive to caffeine, and I know that I have done many a times. In Europe, we get very cheap flights, and I've done a lot of flights where they're like 5 a.m., 6 a.m. sort of realm, and I'm having to get up in some cases at like 1:30 in the morning. So to try and make sure that, because I'm going somewhere where I'm going to go exercise, I'm going there for like a cycling holiday, for example, I want to make sure that I get at least 6 hours sleep the day before. So I'm going to bed quite early. So I've worked on the ability to, one, I'm probably quite fatigued, I'll do a harder workout than normal, and I'm coming into it quite tired, maybe it's a strength session instead, and I'm not consuming any caffeine at all that day. And usually I'm able to get to sleep within 10-15 minutes, even with a 2 or 3 hour earlier bedtime. Now, just for some general ad hoc advice that I think is worth noting, seat location, for example, leg room is kind of key, but make sure it reclines, I would say personally. Sometimes you can either sit behind the extra legroom seats as they can't recline in some cases, or bulkhead seats that can't recline, and then you effectively get that extra bit of legroom, because when someone reclines, if you're a bigger person, it can become a bit uncomfortable, and then you're forced to recline. But often the way the seats move, it means when they recline and you recline, you lose some additional legroom. So being able to sit behind someone who can't recline is always a little win for me. And often these seats can be free. These can be seats that you can move to without a charge. Neck pillows, earplugs, eye masks. Earplugs and eye masks, big fan of. Neck pillows, I think you have to shop around a little bit to find one that really works for you. But I think they're great in concept, and it can make the neck discomfort and the just travel discomfort that much better. People say to limit carry-on, but I hate losing luggage, and to be honest, a lot of the time there is space, especially if you get on the plane early enough and you're not carrying a ridiculous amount, like suitcases. Bags are great for being able to shove in places on the overhead. But if you're someone who's flown a lot and always seems to have stuff having to be put under their seat, then yes, limit your carry-on. As I said, hydration, salt tabs, carbohydrates. This can be in the form of just bars and chews and stuff like that, but just having a way of ensuring that you maximize the water absorption that you are consuming, because it can be a little bit limited. Some sugary drinks that they sell, especially orange juice, can be a good idea for helping with the hydration, and avoiding things like sometimes Coke, because it's got caffeine in it, can become a diuretic and it can hinder things. But sugary drinks in general can be good for hydration, because that sugar is helping bring it on, and the palatability means you're more likely to drink more of it. But just try to get hold of some water in general. And then finally, shoes. In general, keep them on. People say use compression socks, but just sticking to keeping them on can help prevent your feet from swelling and blood pooling at your legs and feet and all that discomfort. And that happens because of the flight process. So what are your takeaways from this? What are the tips that you think were the most interesting, most useful? Are you going to try the supplement list? Are you going to get yourself a neck pillow? Feel free to leave feedback on this episode. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating, and sharing podcasts wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the VO2Lounge@gmail.com or at the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links to all these will be down below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.